Unicorn Overlord is Vanillaware's latest game, a real-time strategy RPG released on all modern consoles except PC. I'll be covering the PlayStation 5 version today. I'm a big fan of this genre, one that is rarely seen nowadays in video games, so I'm happy Vanillaware decided to continue supporting it with this modern release, a game that took 10 years to develop. I'd like to start saying that Vanillaware is a company with George Kamitani as its president. He's been heavily involved in most of the games, often taking charge of direction, writing, and art design. However, Unicorn Overlord seems to be a huge exception to that tradition. Takafumi Noma is its director, programmer, and also lead artist. This might be the primary reason why the character design isn't as flamboyant or exaggerated as in previous Vanillaware games. Actually, Vanillaware's previous RPG, 13 Sentinels, also had different artists. Unicorn also has a different composer, a different producer, and a different lead game designer. I'm telling you all of this because if you played the demo, or at least have seen footage of it, and of course if you've played any games from this company before, you may have noticed how unique it is, how different it feels from any other game by this company. Of course, graphics, visuals, and character design still look absolutely gorgeous, maintaining Vanillaware's traditional beauty. But in terms of writing, gameplay, and the overall feel of it, Unicorn Overlord kinda feels like its own thing. And that's a positive feature here, because it also feels like the game has its own identity. I mentioned it took 10 years to develop. That's because the game was originally planned all the way back in 2014, but between several other works like Dragon's Crown or the remaster of Odin's Sphere or the aforementioned 13 Sentinels, the game just kept getting delayed over and over again. Well, it's finally out, so is it any good? Well, let's start with story. In a world inhabited by different races, the kingdom of Cornea is attacked by General Valmore. His intention is not only to overthrow the queen, but also to conquer every other nation out there to create a powerful empire. So the queen apparently is killed, and therefore Cornea is conquered. Several years later, the queen's son, Prince Alain, the protagonist of this game, readies friends and allies to start a revolution, a liberation campaign against General Valmore. So the story sounds a bit cliché, but it's overall typical of a strategy RPG plot. It's still an interesting premise and hooks the player into a Suikoden or Fire Emblem type of campaign. However, I would like to point out that the real clichés here are the anime tropes. Characters seem a bit stereotyped at first and dialogue sounds generic. It takes a while for true development to show its true colors and slowly reels you back in. In other words, I suggest you be patient with the story, since it does get better later on. Now, this is a real-time strategy RPG like I mentioned. For those unbeknownst to the genre, the first thing you need to know is that it does not play on grids like classic tactical RPGs. This game is basically a love letter to classic series such as Ogre Battle. The goal is to liberate towns, forts, and eventually whole nations, recruiting allies in the way, but it also lets the player walk free around the overworld, surprisingly being an open world. Don't worry, it won't be anywhere near as overwhelming as most true open world RPGs out there, but yes, these games got open world gameplay mechanics. You can traverse to most areas to get involved in different side quests that go from fetch quests to help rebuild the town by finding various items you'll see shining around, to actual missions that include not only liberating even more towns or forts, but also recruiting optional characters. These are strongly, and I mean strongly recommended to do as you unveil more of the story, get new party members, and gain renown and honors. The renown feature is basically your reputation as the Liberation Army, story-wise, but gameplay-wise, you need it primarily to unlock more slots within your unit formations. Looks complicated so far, doesn't it? But nope, it's pretty simple to understand and get into, trust me. You see, in this game, you control small groups of platoons or parties if you want to call them that. Every group can have up to 6 characters, but during the first several hours, you'll only have a few groups and every group will only have 2 or 3 spaces. So renown and also honors, we'll get to those in a bit, is used to unlock more groups and more slots. Honors is something you also get by completing main quests or side quests, but you can also use them to recruit generic soldiers in town. So besides getting optional and or story characters, you can also recruit generic soldiers like I mentioned. Each town has its own unique classes and races for you to recruit, and so on. I insist, it's not as complicated as it seems or sounds. Let's talk about the battle mechanics now. Sometimes you'll see enemies around, they're like random encounters. You touch one and a short battle will begin, but I suggest you ignore them. It shouldn't be too hard to avoid them anyway. You want to fight only in the main or optional quests all the time. So once a mission starts, you'll have a base, and so will the enemy. Actually, the enemy will have more than one, but there will always be a primary base. That's the one you need to conquer in order to complete the mission. Obviously, each base is guarded by enemies, regular enemies for the regular bases, and a boss in the primary one. So at the start of battle, you'll have up to 3 action points. Deploying a group of characters costs 1 action point. How do you get more points? By defeating enemies and liberating bases or towers. Once you do, you'll be able to deploy yet another group, or use a special skill. Every group has a commander, and every commander has their own unique skill. And that's the character you'll see moving around. You need to set the direction you'll want them to move to, and they'll go by themselves on real time. Some will move faster than others depending on the race and or class of the commander. If every group of characters dies, or if your primary base gets captured, it's game over, so keep that in mind. There is no permadeath here, thankfully, so that's something less to worry about. As I mentioned, characters have skills, and some of them can be used to actually heal someone, and there's also campfires that you can use to heal as well, but also to revive fallen allies. Anyway, upon making contact with an enemy, a battle in 2D will occur. It will be played in turns, but out of your control. Turn order depends on classic speed stats, as always, but yeah, your characters will fight freely and attack whoever they feel like. Sometimes they'll have to kill every enemy, sometimes just their commander. Sometimes they'll attack enemies at random, and sometimes the ones in the back, and sometimes just the commander. So at this point you're probably wondering 2 things. Do formations matter? And second, can you influence their actions or decisions during battle? Yes and yes. Formations do matter. It's always best to keep the melee fighters, especially with the best defense stats on the front, and mages or archers and the like in the back. Just like in the Ogre Battle series, or in Soul Nomad, another example of these battle mechanics. Can you influence their actions? Yes, in the menu screen, you'll be able to equip different abilities and passive skills, but also in what conditions to trigger them. There are several, and I mean several different ones you can choose from, and that is my first major complaint with the game. If you've any experience with real-time strategy RPGs like me, this game won't be that difficult on normal mode. There's an easy mode for beginners, and I do recommend it if you aren't experienced in these games. But my problem is that these tactics, these conditions, are way too many and overwhelming, which may make battles unnecessarily harder. Often I felt like the best thing to do was just to leave everything to Lady Luck, have my characters decide what to do in battle and who to attack. Sure, it was frustrating to see them mess up sometimes, but every now and then I prefer dealing with that than with these many conditions. It will certainly be the kind of deep complexity some gamers like though, but for others like me, it was just way too much. There's one other thing I'd like to point out. I'm not sure how I feel about this, as it has its ups and downs. Some bosses require a specific way to defeat them that might be too much of a hassle, honestly. With this one, for example, I ended up brute forcing my way against it with a party of mages. First time I tried something similar but failed miserably, but on a second attempt I pulled through and succeeded miraculously. I believe some of these boss fights can be cheap and unfair for the player, but then again it's quite fun to try again or figure out how to defeat them. You noticed I mentioned a party of mages. Perhaps you're wondering what are the most convenient party setups for every group? Well, there's actually no way to know for sure since every player will have different strategies to win a mission. In the example I showed, that's what worked for me, but others could have won in a different way. What's important here is that you can switch characters across groups at any time, so trying out different formations isn't a bad idea. That's the magic of real-time strategy RPGs, or any tactical RPG actually, that the developers offer a lot of freedom to choose how to approach the many situations you'll have to face in the game. And Unicorn Overlord is a perfect example of this. I think I'll leave it at that. There are some more small gameplay mechanics like positioning guards on every town you liberate, but I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information. I think you're here most likely for the opinion. All in all, the battle mechanics are fantastic. Apart from the condition system for skills, I believe the rest was crafted with insight. It's true that series like Ogre Battle or Grow Lancer are a bit hard to get into, or hell, most real-time strategy games, but the developers made things easier to understand and get into, precisely so more gamers could jump in with no experience whatsoever. As I said, there are difficulty settings so you can adapt with whichever you feel comfortable with. The game is challenging and it gets harder as you advance, but never insane. Unless you take on quests that are a bit above your level, but changing strategies in games like this is never a bad idea, and most missions won't take up much of your time, meaning if you get a game over, it won't be that frustrating to restart the mission. Besides, there are these items that help you prevent a game over. So yeah, it's a challenging game for sure, but with a friendly approach. I really recommend this game. I think it's a must play, something I rarely say about real-time strategy RPGs despite being a die-hard fan of the genre. I say try out the demo. It's quite long, about 6 hours, and depending on what you do, you might get to fight the demo's final boss within that time frame. Can't hurt to try a game for free after all. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!